Hello, I'm Dave Andress. I'm Professor of Modern History at the University of Portsmouth, and today we're going to be talking about the French Revolution. The first topic we're going to talk about is Louis XVI and whether he ever really wanted to make the Constitutional Monarchy work. Louis XVI, of course, was an absolute monarch. He'd been raised up from early childhood to see himself and understand himself as someone who had absolute authority over the country. His coronation oath had made him pledge to support the system of local and aristocratic privileges, which was the way that the old regime had worked. During the Revolution, he was confronted with the need to consider reform and exposed to huge problems of tension and crisis from all sorts of social and political directions. Louis and Queen Marie Antoinette had sought reform during the period of the pre-revolution from 1787, and as late as June 1789 they had wanted a whole programmatic area of reform in the Royal Declaration of the 23rd of June, which would have changed the old regime in certain ways. However, during the revolutionary crises of that month of June and subsequently of July, the King and Queen found themselves in a situation which they were no longer in control of. And although the King, for example, on the 17th of July, after the fall of the Bastille, came and made a reconciliation with the city of Paris, appearing to put himself back in charge of the revolution, back in sympathy with the revolutionaries, there were always going to be questions about what that actually meant in practice. And it wasn't long before those questions come to the surface. Later on in the summer of 1789, the Revolutionary National Assembly produces the abolition of feudalism, the abolition of privilege after the famous night of the 4th of August, and later on in the month of August produces the Declaration of the Rights of Man, a very explicit statement that they're wanting to create a society which is now based on equal individuals, where all the corporate and aristocratic privileges that had made up the old regime have simply been swept to one side. In these documents they put out in August 1789, they themselves proclaim that they see Louis as the restorer of French liberty. They expect him to lead this process. But it very quickly becomes clear that Louis is not actually interested in doing this. A stalemate ensues politically after the production of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, where the king, as king, is expected to sign these documents and officially promulgate them, but refuses to do so, leaves them sitting on his desk at Versailles. And this then evolves towards a critical situation in late September and early October, famously resolved by the March on Versailles, where Parisian women in early October, complaining about shortage of food and complaining about this political stalemate, go in very large numbers to the Palace of Versailles, cause considerable disruption, some dangerous violence, and lead to an agreement between the King and Queen and the revolutionary leadership that the royal family will move to Paris, where the revolutionaries feel it will be safe from counter-revolutionary corruption, but where the royal family very quickly come to understand themselves as prisoners. And this is the fundamental situation that we see Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette in from that point onwards. From the autumn of 1789, they identify themselves really as being in resistance to the revolution. Louis will write to his cousin, the King of Spain, shortly after moving to Paris, to say effectively that whatever he does now is against his will, that the position he wanted to carry through in June of 1789 is still what he wants to happen, and that the revolutionaries are effectively forcing him to do things. And from that point onwards, he and the Queen are really playing a deceptive double game with public opinion, with the French revolutionary leadership, with the counter-revolutionaries who've gone into emigration and exile, and with the crowned heads of Europe. At various points in time, Louis proclaims himself again in sympathy with the revolutionaries. There's a famous episode in February of 1790, for example, when he visits Paris, when there's a great deal of celebration about seeing this as a statement of willingness to carry forward the revolutionary settlement, But at the same time, Louis and Marie Antoinette are encouraging emigrated former ministers like the Baron de Breteuil to act for them with the powers of Europe to try to bring about a counter-revolution. There's a certain amount of evidence from recent historical work that Louis did try to adapt the structures of his court, the day-to-day practices of life around him, to become a little less aristocratic, to allow the Revolutionary National Guard, for example, a stronger role in guarding his person, in playing a role in court life. But there's no evidence that there was ever any real acceptance by Louis and Marie Antoinette of what the revolutionaries were doing. And it's important at this point to recognise that the king in particular had very serious moral reservations about what the revolution was doing. He was a sincerely devout man. He believed in the religious basis of his kingship, of his responsibility for the moral salvation of his people, the maintenance of their Catholicism as a factor in that salvation, and the maintenance of the church as an institution which was essential to the social order, to peace, and so forth. So as the revolutionaries had effectively attacked the church, as they dispossessed of its property, as they'd reorganised it, Louis very much came to see this as a religious, spiritual, moral issue on which he felt he had to take a stand. This is part of what pushes him towards thinking, probably at least by the end of 1790, that he has to get away from the revolution. And this will result most famously, of course, in the flight to Varennes on the 21st of June 1791, when the king and the queen and their children do actually physically leave Paris, attempt to go towards the eastern frontiers, and historians have argued for a long time about exactly what they're intending to do. Are they intending to leave the country? Are they intending to join up with the army and negotiate some kind of settlement? But one way or the other, it was clear that they wanted to get away from Paris. They left behind very clear written evidence in the king's hand that he did not accept anything that the revolution was doing. He was still looking back to June 1789. And the Queen had in fact corresponded 4 months to bring this flight about, to talk very clearly with her correspondents about how they would reshape the government of France to be more like the old regime again. The royal family were of course recaptured at Varennes, and of course they then have to do a deal with the revolutionary leadership, essentially to preserve their dignity, to safeguard themselves from further physical harm, certainly in the mind of the king and queen, and ultimately at the end of that summer, in September and October 1791, to accept the constitution, to bring a constitutional monarchy into existence. One of the things we know about Louis XVI at that moment, when he had to swear an oath to uphold the constitution, is that as soon as he was in private, he broke down and wept. The humiliation of the event, the extent to which he felt he'd been pressurised into it to protect the physical safety of his children, really put an overwhelming emotional strain on him. From this time on, now that he has recovered some of his constitutional powers, we can see that he is still using them to thwart the ambitions of the revolutionary political leadership. That political leadership is starting to be dominated by the group that eventually we'll call the Girondins, led by people like Brissot, and they are very aggressive about pursuing war against the counter-revolution and against its foreign supporters. As that develops, at the end of 1791 and into 1792, we also see, through royal correspondence, through what we know that the ministerial government was doing, a decision effectively by Louis and Marie Antoinette that they too would like a war, but their ambition for that war really is that France should be defeated through it, that it would actually be an opportunity to invite military intervention by the powers of Europe to, again, put down the revolutionaries, again, restore the church, again, return the political settlement to June 1789, which would always remain Louis's principal desire in this whole situation. And of course, when war comes about, much of this is speculated about amongst radical circles. As the war itself, from April through to August 1792, goes very badly, The king is increasingly identified as the problem in the mix. The man who is the chief executive of the country is nominating ministers and generals, and who is, by definition, through the suspicion of the revolutionaries, stopping the war succeeding. And so there will be the movement towards the famous day of the 10th of August, where, under pressure of invasion by Parisian radical forces, the king and the queen will surrender themselves to the National Assembly, and after that there will be the terrible massacre of the Swiss Guards. But that violence actually takes place after the king has already effectively given up his power, yielded to the control of the revolution, and become a prisoner. Now that Louis and Marie Antoinette had been removed from power, they could very clearly identify themselves as prospective martyrs and victims of the revolution. And that, of course, is how they would go down in history. Louis would be charged with treason in mismanaging the war effort, and it's very clear that he was guilty of that, and also guilty much more generally of not wanting the war and the revolution to succeed. Marie Antoinette, sadly and ironically, would have some deeply unpleasant personal charges levelled against her and her sexuality, but the historical record also shows that she was very actively a co-conspirator with her husband in trying to bring about a military counter-revolution. So in summary, the overwhelming evidence of the historical record is that despite the best efforts of the revolutionaries, who persistently gave the king and the queen new chances to reconcile with the revolution, it was always a step too far as they were concerned.